On August 11, 1965, Marquette Fry, a black man living in Watts, was arrested for speeding and drunk driving. This was merely a routine arrest, but when rumors spread that an act of police brutality had occurred, the Watts Riot began. The riot began after the arrest of Marquette Fry, but the causes laid much deeper than that. In reference to the arrest itself, author Murray L. Swartz wrote in the Saturday Review that catalyst it may have been, cause it was not. What really caused the riot was years of built-up frustrations, as African Americans were treated like second-class citizens across the country. Because the Watts Riot was an outburst in just one black community, out of many facing the same frustrations, compromise in this one isolated case was not going to bring about the change that was sought by black Americans in the 1960s. The riot, which was one of the first notable violent protests of the civil rights movement, instead began to sway black people's opinions on violence as an effective means of protest. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the civil rights movement was in its peak. Provoked by a series of injustices, racism, prejudice, and violence against the black community, the fight for equality among the races and freedom from oppression were the prominent objectives of the movement. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of the unfulfilled promise of emancipation. He stated, "The Emancipation Proclamation did not, however, bring full freedom to the Negro, for although he enjoyed certain political and social opportunities during the Reconstruction, the Negro soon discovered that the Pharaohs of the South were determined to keep him in slavery." The inequality between the races and maltreatment of African Americans resulted in anger and discontent. King preached nonviolence as a means of advocating for change, but in 1965, constant dissatisfaction led to conflict and violence.
So that's what happened in Watts. So you had a whole history of oppression, basically, and police brutality that just sort of culminated in one silly traffic stop.
Watts, the neighborhood in Los Angeles in which the riot took place, had a majority black population. In the 1960s, minorities in Los Angeles faced racism, prejudice, invisibility in the media, and above all, a worse standard of living. As stated in The Politics of Violence by John B. McConaughey and David Sears, only 2% of the space in the LA Times in 1965 covered black news, and that usually consisted of police reports and a poor portrayal of the black community. What the white community never saw was the police brutality, the poverty, and the growing frustration.
It's a whitey here. You ask him, do he have any type of work for you to do? He'll tell you no, and the next day you come up there, he's putting a white person right in the stand of you.
African Americans were segregated from the rest of the population, denied jobs due to their race, and over 41% of the population saw police brutality as a major concern. This is in contrast to only 23% of the rest of the United States at the time. In the neighborhood of Watts, irritation and resentment were present and ever-growing. One single conflict, one simple arrest, provoked the people into fighting in what is now known as the Watts Riot. The riot in its entirety lasted for 6 days and covered a 46 square mile area. To put that into perspective, that is 1.5 times the size of Manhattan and larger than all of San Francisco. Because it took up so much space, the rioters were not unified in method or degree of violence, but were all fighting due to shared struggles and frustrations. The police tried to shut down the riot with assertion of power, however, they achieved no success. Due to the history of distrust in the community of Watts towards the police, when they arrived, there was a heightened discomfort, which then escalated the situation. Violence arose as a defense mechanism which was provoked by the presence of the police. Looting and burning were not prominent at the beginning of the riot, but following the police's attempts to shut down the riot, it escalated to the point where the government felt the need to get involved. The conflict, which could not be shut down with local power, instead needed the National Guard.
I think I'm able to carry on.
Because of this, by the time the National Guard was called to shut down the riot, the damage had already been done. 34 people were dead, 1,032 people injured, 3,952 people arrested, 1,000 buildings damaged, and over $40 million in damages. The investigation that followed as a result of the forceful shutdown of the riot was unfair and led to little change and compromise. The McCone Commission, the official government investigation with only one black person out of a group of 31, concluded that the riot was instigated by the outsiders of society. Because of this portrayal, it took away any political significance it had. This was no longer a fight for the whole black community and its rights, but instead for the fringes of society. They had no chance to advocate for their equality in the government because, according to the government, this wasn't the black community. There was no room to compromise and improve the lives of the community of Watts, which at a glance may appear to be a lost cause. However, the majority of the black population had a more positive outlook on the riot. 38% of the population of Watts saw the event more as a revolution than a riot. This means that they believed the event had political motives and that they were trying to fight for their equal rights. This is in comparison to only 13% of white people in the country. Though they had undergone violence and many deaths, copious amounts of people felt that they had won. Their voices were heard as they gained more attention in the media, and to many, that was all that mattered. They hoped that with their lists of grievances heard, society would change or else rise up and fight, even if the government didn't institute that change. There was a perceived stereotype among white people that the black community was one of violence, and this riot helped their theory. This led to even more division between the races after the conflict. The polarization of opinions on the success of the riot made quite evident the racial divide. There is no doubt that the riot did bring some benefits to the Watts community, at least temporarily. One source in the LA riot study suggested that there had been an increase in white politicians answering African American demands, and this appeared to be the case, as various programs were instituted in the neighborhood. These programs included the Watts Labor Community Action Committee and Westminster Neighborhood Association, which aided people in finding work as well as medical and social services that were much needed. On the flip side, the riot was not wholly successful in terms of its long-term effects on the community of Watts. Many of the programs instituted were short-lived, while many aspects of life did not improve. In the book, Watts the Aftermath, a black community member felt it to be degrading or unnecessary that white members were holding the jobs in these programs instituted to help the struggling black members of Watts, and voiced a wanting for control over their own community. Also, by 1966, just 1 year later, the incline in representation in the media had decreased back to what it had been prior to the riot. Though there were no long-term benefits for the neighborhood of Watts after the forceful shutdown of the riot, and no compromise at all in the stance for racial equality, the riot still brought about great change for the nation by spurring on the normalization of violence as a tool for protest. One black man who participated in the riot, in an interview with CBS, even said, "If necessary, we would start another riot. I'm not afraid of bloodshed. If I have to die for my rights, I will." The temporary benefits that Watts obtained from the riot led many black Americans around the country to seek betterment for their own community, following in the footsteps of the violent Watts Riot. From 1965 to 1968, outbreaks of violence rippled across many other parts of the country, including a total of 159 race riots in 1967, the most prominent being Detroit, where 43 people died. Though there was a shift in means of protest, and though it was at times effective in catalyzing the civil rights movement, as stated by Maria J. Stephan and Erica Chenoweth, nonviolent methods are more effective, on average, as compared with violent tactics because they enhance both domestic and international legitimacy while also constraining state deployment of violence to suppress the movement. Despite violence being less effective means of protest, in his speech, The Other America, King states,
"In the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. What is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention.